Great. Good morning. If you're all doing well this morning, if you've got a Bible with you, I want you to turn with me to Joshua chapter 3. If you don't have a Bible, the ushers are in the back. They've got Bibles. Just wave to them. They'll bring them over your way. And make sure to get one to you. Joshua chapter 3. If you weren't here last week, we actually started a new series. We're studying through the book of Joshua. It's called Overcoming Giants. And the reason for that title is really because of the context of what's happening in the book of Joshua. This is at the very start of Joshua. We find the nation of Israel has just come for the second time to the border of the Promised Land. Go back all the way to Genesis, which we did last week, Genesis chapter 15. God makes a promise to Abraham that he's going to have descendants, and they're going to end up in a land that's not their own. They're going to end up as slaves, but he's going to rescue them out of that, and he's going to bring them to this land, what we know as the Promised Land. Right? He's going to give them this land at that point in time, and we see that happening all the way from Genesis through Exodus. Right? We find them actually coming to the border of the Promised Land for the first time in Numbers chapter 13, and they send 12 spies into the land to go and check it out, and the 12 spies come back, and they all have there's two things that they find. On one thing, they're all agreed. The land's better than we could have imagined. I mean, it's the dream. It's what we've been dreaming for. We've been in slavery. We've been in the wilderness. But now we've got this land before us, and God's told us the land flowing with milk and honey, which is basically, he's describing it as full of abundance. It's going to have everything that you need is going to be right there. And they come back and they say that's exactly what it is, but there's the place that they disagree. 2 of the spies say, hey, God's given us the land, let's go in and take it. 10 of them say, forget it, we're not going in. We need to run the other direction. And the reason that they say that is because of fear. Last week we defined fear, and you see it there in your notes, and I just want to show it to you again. Last week we defined fear as the product of looking to the future and assuming that God isn't going to show up the way that he should. It's looking to the future and assuming that God isn't going to show up the way that he should. Fear lives in uncertainty. Fear lives in the what-ifs and the things that might be out there. But more than that, because you can have uncertainty and not be afraid. So it's not just uncertainty. There's another piece to fear. And the other piece to fear is that you assume that God isn't going to show up. And by the way, you see some of the symptoms of fear there in the notes. There's different ways that it can come out. It's not just being scared. Fear can come out in worry. It can come out in stress. It can come out in anxiety. Sometimes it comes out in anger. Have you ever seen somebody who gets scared and gets really angry? Why is that? Well, part of it is that's just the way that they express their fear, but also another part of it is that's the way they try to cover up the fact that they're afraid as well. But there's different ways that it can come out in your life. It can come out from oversleeping. It can come out from the fact that you can't sleep. But everyone deals with fear. Last week, I said over and over, God says again and again, don't be afraid, don't be afraid, don't be afraid. 2 things that tells us. Number 1, fear is a problem. It's a real issue for people. It's an issue for all of us. But the second thing is that God has the solution. But so fear lives in the future, but it also lives in this idea that we look at the future and the assumption is God isn't going to show up, at least not in the way we think he should. For Israel, here they are, they're on the border of the Promised Land, and the reason those 10 spies say, forget it, let's not go in the land, is because when they go in, they see the people living in the land. And the people living in the land are like giants. And so they come back out and they say, listen, if we go in, we're dead. If we go into the land, there's no way that we're going to survive. We're going to get slaughtered. Why is that? Why are they saying that? Not because God has said to them, hey, listen, it's all on you. In fact, God said just the opposite. He said it's all on him. All you need to do is follow me. Because I have, and God has said this, I've already given this to you. The land is already yours. I've given these people who are living in the land over to you so you can go in and take the land. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen in a day. It's going to take you time, and there's a reason for that, as we looked at last week. But I'm going to go with you. I'm going to go before you. I'm going to be behind you. You don't have to be afraid because I am your God. So why do they respond in fear? Because they have an under-reliance on God and an over-reliance on themselves. An under-reliance on God and an over-reliance on themselves. They believe that they are going to go in the land and it's not going to go well because God's not going to show up in the way that he should. There's giants living in the land. Which begs 2 questions for us that I asked last week. What are the things that cause fear in your life? Where are you dealing with fear? Again, fear lives in the uncertainty of looking at the future. And when it lives, now listen, fear is, people ask the question, is it a sin to be afraid? In some ways I say, it's the same thing as asking, is it a sin to be tempted? It passes through your life. Everyone deals with fear. It's a question of what do you do with it. If you live in it, that's a sin. So it's going to come into your life. Where are the places that you're tempted to live in fear? That uncertainty that it could, and there's so many different places it can come out in a health issue. I was just talking to someone before the service who's got surgery this week. That could lead to fear. It could be a family situation. It could be a job situation. It's whatever that uncertainty, whatever that future is, right now for you, that is tempting you to live in fear. What is it? And how is it manifesting itself in your life? Stress, worry, anxiety, anger? How's that coming out? Another way to ask it, and this is the second question, is what are the giants that you're facing? And we define giants there in your notes again. What are giants? Giants are obstacles or enemies that cause you to fear, by which you are tempted to respond in disobedience to God, but over which God has called you to live in victory. They're the things, giants are the things that are causing you fear. And those things that cause you fear tempt you, instead of going the way that God's calling you, instead of following after Him, they're tempting you to go the other direction. But what God is always saying, and the direction that God is always calling us, is to follow Him. He's always calling us forward, which means He's always calling us to address our giants, to live in victory over them, because that's what it looks like to follow God. When we're living in fear, controlled by fear of the giants in front of us, that's not where God wants us. And so God's not saying, hey, let's just avoid that, let's go another direction. God is saying, listen, here's the thing. Walking with me is always going to lead you towards the challenges, but here's the good news. I'm with you. I'm with you. Here's what you need to do. Follow me. I've given you victory. Follow me. I'm with you. Follow me. There are things that are bigger than you, but they're not bigger than Him. Follow me, God says. And that's where we find ourselves in Joshua chapter 1. Moses, they reject God, they go their own way. For 40 years they wander in the wilderness. God won't let them in the land. But 40 years pass, Moses dies out in the wilderness before they get into the promised land, and God appoints Joshua as the next leader. And the first thing that God says to Joshua right away, so Joshua takes over responsibility, and God says, okay, we're going into the land now. Let's go. Be strong and courageous. Have I not commanded you? Do not live in fear. We're going in. I will be with you. I'll never leave you or forsake you. Only keep my word. Follow it. Meditate on it. It's what we looked at last week in Joshua chapter 1. And then in chapter 2, which we're not looking at this morning. We're going to come back to that when we get to chapter 6. In chapter 2, so here they are. They're getting ready to go in the land. They send spies in again, but 2 this time instead of the 12. And the 2 spies come back at the end of chapter 2 and they say, God's given us the land. Let's go in and take it. And now we come to chapter 3. So take a look with me. Joshua chapter 3. Would you stand with me as we read? And we're not going to read all. We're going to look at chapter 3 and 4. We're not reading all of it. So don't worry, you have to stand for a whole 2 chapters. We're going to start in we're going to read 1 through 5 and then skip down to 12. Joshua chapter 3, verse 1. Then Joshua rose early in the morning and they set out from Shittim. And they came to the Jordan, he and all the people of Israel, and lodged there before they passed over. At the end of 3 days, the officers went through the camp and commanded the people, as soon as you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God being carried by the Levitical priests, then you shall set out from your place and follow it. Yet there shall be a distance between you and it, about 2,000 cubits in length. Do not come near it, in order that you may know the way you shall go, for you have not passed this way before. Then Joshua said to the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. Skip down to verse 12 with me. Now therefore take 12 men from the tribes of Israel, from each tribe a man, and when the soles of the feet of the priests bearing the ark of the Lord of all the earth, shall rest in the waters of the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off from flowing, and the waters coming down from above shall stand in one heap. So when the people set out from their tents to pass over the Jordan, with the priests bearing the ark of the covenant before the people, and as soon as those bearing the ark had come as far as the Jordan, and the feet of the priests bearing the ark were dipped in the brink of the water, now the Jordan overflows all its banks throughout the time of harvest. The waters coming down from above stood and rose up in a heap very far away at Adam, the city besides Zarethan. And those flowing down toward the sea of the Arabah, the salt sea, were completely cut off, and the people passed over opposite Jericho. Now the priests bearing the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan, and all Israel was passing over on dry ground until all the nation finished passing over the Jordan. When all the nation finished passing over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Take 12 men from the people, from each tribe a man, and command them, saying, Take 12 stones from here out of the midst of the Jordan, from the very place where the priest's feet stood firmly, and bring them over with you, and lay them down in the place where you lodge tonight." And then skip down with me to, we're going to start in verse 19, finish chapter 4. The people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they encamped at Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. And those 12 stones which they took out of the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. And he said to the people of Israel, "When your children ask their fathers in times to come, 'What do these stones mean?' then you shall let your children know, Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did the Red Sea, which he dried up for us until we passed over. So that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever." This is God's word. Would you pray with me? Father, thank you for your word to us this morning. And I know, Lord, today here in this community, there are people who are facing challenges and difficulties that are much bigger than just them. There's people here this morning who are dealing with fears. Maybe feeling overwhelmed by circumstances and situations in their lives. But Lord, what you teach us here in this passage is that though our circumstances may be bigger than us, there are none that are bigger than you. And so, Father, today I pray that we'd be set free from that fear. The fear that so many live in because they don't know you. God, we're your people. Just as Israel was your people, so we are your people. And God, just as you are with Israel, so you are with us. And as you've not just encouraged us, but commanded us, do not be afraid, Lord, that we would be able to walk in that. That we would be able to walk in freedom from fear because we know that you, the living God, Lord of all the earth, you are with us. And so today, remind us of that. Today, strengthen our faith. To help us to be reminded, Lord, of all that you've done. That we might face the future filled with faith, knowing, Lord, that you've been faithful and you will continue to be. And may it serve to grow us that we might truly be a light into this world. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Go ahead and be seated. So most of the time we take the advice from, remember in The Sound of Music? Let's start at the very beginning. It's a very good place to start. Today we're going to not take that advice. We're going to start at the end and work our way back. And at the very end of the passage, what do we find? Very end of the passage, God has Israel set up a memorial. It's not a complicated memorial. It's not one of those really fancy ones. It doesn't have carvings on it. It doesn't have all of the details on it. It's a very simple and yet a very profound memorial that God has Israel set up. As they're passing through the Jordan River, he says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take those 12 stones from where the priests are standing. Remember, the priests go into the water first. God parts the water. They go in, and they're standing in the middle. As everyone else is passing through, the priests with the ark are standing. It's a long day for the priests, by the way. They've got to stand in the middle while everybody else passes through. And after they pass through, then they got to go back. And they say, go back, grab the 12 stones, bring them out, and we're going to set up a memorial. And what's a memorial? Right, memorial, I put a simple definition there in your notes. A memorial is something that has been put in place to remind you of important events that should shape how you live today. A memorial, and it doesn't have to be a physical memorial. It could be all sorts. There's a number of ways that you can have memorials in your life. But God says, I want you to set up a memorial, a sign. He says actually in chapter 4, I think it's verse 5, a sign which can also be interpreted as a reminder. I want you to set up a physical, visible reminder, something that is going to remind you what's happened in the past that should be shaping how you live today. For Israel, it's this moment. God's saying, I want you to remember this moment. For the time moving forward, I want there to be something in place physically that you'll be able to see. And these weren't small stones, right? It wasn't, hey, let's find a nice rock there on the bottom. These are big stones that they're going to carry over on their shoulders, and they set them up as a physical, visible reminder that is meant to shape the way that they live moving forward. Here they are, they're crossing into the promised land. This is their first step. The first time, from the time that they were in slavery, the first time that they're stepping across and entering into the promised land, and God says, you need to set up a memorial, because I want you to remember this, so that you know how you ought to live moving forward. And by the way, as we go through, God set up memorials for us as well. We're talking about Israel's memorial this morning, but God has put things in place for us that ought to be doing the same things. And there's 3 ways that this ultimately is meant to serve as an instruction for Israel. That when they pass by it, when they see it, it's meant to say here, it's meant to shape the way that they live. And there's 3 ways, right? It's meant to be a call to worship. It's meant to be a call to faith. And it's meant to be a call to obedience. This physical altar, this memorial, these 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan River, God has them set it up as that physical reminder, as a call to worship, a call to faith, and a call to obedience. And by the way, our memorials serve the same purpose, and we'll talk about that as we go through. But first of all, it's meant to serve as a call to worship. Why? Because God just performed a miracle. Right? This is not one of those memorials they're meant to look at and go, hey, remember what we did? Remember what we accomplished? Right? We had this problem in front of us, but then we put a plan together and we kind of thought through it, we worked through it, we fought through it, and we got it done. It was all on us and we accomplished it. No, this is meant to be a reminder of not what they did to accomplish getting across the river, but what God did for them. Stop and remember, the reason you're here is not because you got here on your own, but God did this for you. It's not because of your ingenuity, not because of your wisdom. It's not because of your planning. It's not because of your preparation. It's because God was doing this on your behalf. God says, hey, we're going into the promised land. The spies come back and say we should go in and take it. That's great news. The bad news is that there's something in the way. There's an obstacle. It's the Jordan River. And the thing about the Jordan River, at normal seasons, it's about 3 to 10 feet deep and about, at most, 98 feet across. So it doesn't sound like it's really that big of a deal. But what this passage makes clear, and we actually read it, is this is basically at flood stage. It's springtime. And if you've ever been in a river at flood stage, what might not have been really that big of a deal can become life-threatening in a heartbeat. I grew up in upstate New York, and we used to go canoeing down a river called the Battenkill. It flows right into the Hudson. And that was one of the things that my dad and the boys, actually the whole family, we would go and do. And we would never go at flood stage because it was dangerous. Of course, then you get older and suddenly Dad goes, okay, now we can start doing things that we didn't do before. And one year we decided we're going to go at flood stage because that would be a lot of fun. And so we went with some friends of ours. And the thing about the Battenkill is it's very windy. You can't see around around the turns. It's that windy. And so we're coming at one point in time, and it's flowing. I mean, it's fast. And by the way, this is not a big river. We're talking maybe 20 feet wide. And yes, probably places where it's 10, maybe even 15 feet deep, but it is not a huge river. But at flood stage, this is powerful. So we're coming through, and we're coming around a bend, and there's cliffs on both sides. I mean, we're really tall cliffs. And standing up, the people that we're with are ahead of us, and we can't see them. And standing up on the cliff, there's somebody up there going like this. And we're looking up going, okay, well, I have no idea who that is. Hello, it's nice to see you. And you come around the bend. It would have been a good opportunity to go, okay, there might be a problem up ahead, but we're not really thinking about that. You come around the edge, and we look up, and the other boat has been tipped over. Everybody's out struggling in the water, which, again, is moving very fast. And you look up, and the turn in the river, it comes around, and there is a tree that is bent over just like this. And all of the water is going straight at the tree, rushing up and over it, and then going the other direction. And so here we are in the water, and my dad's a pretty strong guy. I'm semi-strong, but my dad he's a police officer, lifted weights all the time. I mean, he's a strong guy, and he's in the back, and he's doing everything he can to try to get us out of the current, and there's nothing he can do to control the boat. We go straight up, ride right up over it, flip over, and head down the river. Nothing that we could do. We were out of control. Right? This is not normal time of the year. This is flood stage. In fact, let me show you a picture. Did you get that picture in there for me, Michael? Not that one. Not that one. Oh, no, the one right before it. There it is. Flood stage. So what might not seem like that big of a deal, most of the time, a pretty big deal. And by the way, God's plan is, hey, here we are. We're on the edge of the Jordan River. In fact, go to that next slide for me. Because where they are, where the arrow is, that's where they're at. And God says, here's what we're going to do. We're going in. We're crossing the Jordan River, which if you and I are there, at least if I'm there, I'm going, that's really not that great of an idea. Because there's two other options. Number one, let's wait. The river's at flood stage. All we got to do is give it a little bit of time. Once it calms down, then we can go across the river. Let's forget this. Or the other option is, you've got the sea down here. Let's just go down and around the sea. Which is, by the way, the first way that they came to the land was down below. That's where they first came to the promised land. We could just go back down to where we were in the first place. And God says, no, here's where we're going. We're going across. Now, why is that? Because here's what we need to remember. When God is leading the way and we're following Him, let's just be very clear. Oftentimes, this is exactly the way He's leading us. And we're tempted to go, well, wisdom says that's really not the best idea. And God says, no, but that's where we're going. Why? Why? Let me give you 3 reasons. Number one, to remind them who He is. To remind them who He is. And who is He? Look at verse 10 and 11. We didn't actually read verse 10 and 11, but I want to take a look at it. Chapter 3, verse 10. He says, and Joshua said, here is how you shall know that the living God, listen to the words that are used to describe God here. This is how you shall know that the living God is among you, and that He will without fail drive out before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, and the Jebusites. Behold, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth is passing before you into the Jordan. Do you see the 2 ways that are used to describe God? Number one, what does it say? What's the first thing He says? He's what? He's the living God. Now that may sound strange to you, but here's the distinction that God is making. He's saying there's all of these other gods that all the nations worship, and then there's me. I'm actually living, all of the other gods are dead. In what sense? That they're not real. Right? Well, this is not Greek mythology. There's our God and then there's a bunch of other gods. There's one true living God. All the other gods that all the other nations worship are not real gods. They're made up. They're things that men have created. Go back to Egypt, by the way. When God is bringing them out of Egypt, do you remember each one of those plagues? Do you know that each one of those plagues was God's judgment on one of the gods, each one of the gods in Egypt? He's saying, look, I'm the one true living God. All these other gods they're not real. They're dead. They can't hear, they can't speak, they can't act, they can't do anything. Because they've been made by men. They've been recreated by them. God says, I haven't been made by you. I am the living God. I'm the God who's made you. And here's what that means. That means I'm the one who can do miracles. I'm the one who can do whatever's needed. In fact, the second way that He's described is what? As the Lord of all the earth. In other words, not only is He the one true living God, but He's the King of it all. He's the King of kings. He's the Lord of lords. Everything falls under His authority. There's nothing that doesn't fall under His authority. And that's what He goes on to show them, by the way, when He brings them through the Jordan River. This is, by the way, Israel's first battle in the Promised Land. Not with another nation, but with themselves. Because they're facing an obstacle that is bigger than them. They're facing something that they cannot deal with in and of themselves. And it's a question of, are we going to run in fear as we did before, as our ancestors did 40 years back? Or are we going to trust God and follow Him where He's leading, even through what we would see as the impossible? And God says, I'm the living God. I'm the one who can do miracles. And not only that, I'm the one who's in charge of all of creation. So it doesn't matter what's in your way. It doesn't matter if it's a nation living in the land or a river that's in flood stage. I've got it under control. Are you going to follow me or not? I'm the living God. I'm the Lord of all of creation. And by the way, there's a third thing. Even though we don't see him described this way, we see him acting this way. He's also showing himself as the God who saves. He's the God who rescues his people. And by the way, we do actually see it described at the very end of chapter 4. Do you remember what Joshua connects the parting of the Jordan River with? The parting of the Red Sea. He says, listen, God just parted this river, but do you remember he did that before? He did it at the Red Sea. Why? Because he's the God who saves us. He's the God who rescues us. He's the God who provides for us. You remember at the borders of the Red Sea, they're coming out of Egypt. Pharaoh's army is behind them. And everybody's going, thanks Moses for bringing us out so that we could die in the wilderness so they don't have to dig graves back in Egypt for us anymore. Thanks. And they're speaking out. They're angry at him. And do you remember what he says? He says, stand still and watch the salvation that the Lord will work on your behalf today. He says, don't move. Guess what? You don't have to do anything because God's going to do it all for you. And so God parts the Red Sea. He brings them through. And Joshua says, do you remember that? He's done it again. He's done it again. He's led us through. And what is it that they're following? Again, they're following God, but God has a specific object in place that is representative of his presence. What is it? It's the Ark of the Covenant. And you remember what's on top of the Ark of the Covenant is the mercy seat. The mercy seat is the place where the priests would come and one time a year on the Day of Atonement, and they would sprinkle blood in atonement for the sins of the nation of Israel. It was the place where God's presence not only dwelt, but it was the place where God provided for the forgiveness of the sins of his people. Not only does he rescue them physically from Israel, not only does he bring them through the Jordan River, but he's leading them by his salvation as the God who provides the way for their sins to be forgiven. So he's reminding them who he is. And he's reminding them who they are. And who are they? They're his people. He's saying, listen, we're going into this land, but here's the good news. I'm going with you. I am your God and you are my people. I'm going to go before you. Remember, he sends the priests in first with the Ark of the Covenant, representative of God's presence. Not only does he go before them, but he actually stays with them. He stays there, the Ark of the Covenant, in the middle of the Jordan River, while everybody else is passing through. There the Ark of the Covenant with the priest stays. Because he's saying, listen, I'm not leaving you behind. I'm actually going before you. I'm going to be with you. And then after they get out of the water, only after that, does the Ark of the Covenant come out and the waters go back. Why? Because God's saying, not only am I before you, I'm with you, and not only am I before you and with you, I'm also behind you. You're my people. And the third thing he's telling them, the third reason he does this, is to show the nations who he is. These are my people, and I am coming with them. You look at this picture, and it doesn't show it really well. It's hard to tell. But the distance from where they're crossing the river in Jericho really is actually not that far. In fact, Jericho is situated in such a place that they'd be able to see this whole thing happening. And you can imagine Jericho, it looks like the river's at flood stage. And by the way, in chapter 2, we find out that the buzz in town is that the Israelites are on the other side of the Jordan River. But the good news for them, at least in their minds, is the river's at flood stage, so we've got nothing to worry about right now. Imagine thinking, okay, here we are, we're safe. Yeah, Israel's over there, big group of people. But the river's at flood stage, we've got nothing to worry about. And suddenly, the water in the Jordan River at flood stage stops. And by the way, it says it piles up. Miles north at the city of Adam. And then you see a whole mass of people coming through the nation of Israel that you know is out there. You've been watching them. You've been seeing them. And now here they are, and they're coming through. The message is really clear. In fact, we're told that they take the 12 stones and they set them up on the other side. And I've been told this. I haven't been able to confirm it. I could be wrong. But I've been told that archaeologists believe they found the place where the stones were set up, and that it appears that before the stones were there, that there was actually a pagan altar that was there before it. And that they take those stones down and they put those stones in place. Either way, the message is very clear. The living God, the Lord of all of the earth, is coming with his people. And so set these stones up, and what is it? It's a call to worship. It's a call to remember. Look back. Look at what God has done. Remember. Don't forget. And by the way, the wonderful thing about this is God knows that we're forgetful people. You and I, we are. We forget what God has done. We forget the miracles that He's worked in our lives. And they're miracles. They're things that we go, boy, I'll never forget that. And yet, here's the thing. Here's what I know about you, because I know it about me as well. There's plenty of times where we forget that. We forget those miracles that we say we'd never forget, and yet God has done them. And God says to Israel, I want you to set this up because I don't want you to forget. And it's a call to worship because, again, it's not what we did, it's not what Israel did, it's what God did for them. I said at the beginning, I said God's given us memorials as well. What are those memorials that God's given us? The cross, the empty tomb. Two very clear memorials for us. We may not have the actual cross and the physical tomb to look at. But what about communion? Some people, some of you come from churches where they don't celebrate it that often. Some of you come churches where they celebrate it every week. Right, we celebrate every other week. And there's a reason that we do that. Because it is one of the memorials that God has given us that we need as a reminder of what God has done for us already, the miracle that He's worked. That He made a way where there was no way, and we need that reminder. We need to remember. In fact, what does Jesus say? Do this in remembrance what? Of me. You need to remember. And I know you're going to forget. I know you're going to lose sight of it, and so you need to be reminded of it all the time. Because it's meant to shape the way that you live today and tomorrow and the next day and the day after that. Baptism is another memorial. We're going to celebrate baptism on March 29th. We're having our next baptism service. Which, by the way, may be one of the giants that some of you are facing. Say, well, I don't need to get baptized. And I wonder if some of us, it's fear that holds us back from taking the step that we ought to. But is baptism not a memorial that God set up in place to remind us of what He's done? Right, we put someone under the water, buried in the likeness of His death. And then we raise them up, raised to walk in the newness of life. Why? Because it is a physical, visible reminder of what God has done, past, what God has done in that person's life. Because when they believed in Jesus Christ as their Savior, they were united with Him in His death and His resurrection. They've died to sin. The power of sin has been broken, and they've been raised up to a whole new life. With the hope and the certainty of eternity because of the finished work of Christ. It is a physical, visible reminder. And what are those things meant to serve for? They're meant, here's number one, a call to worship. Because here's what every single one of those things reminds us of. Not what we have done for God, but what God has done for us. He's the one who's fought on our behalf. We didn't cross from this life into eternal life because of what we did. We didn't accomplish this. God accomplished it for us. We didn't become Christians because of how good and moral we were. That's not how you become a Christian. Christianity is not entered into by morality or being a good enough person. It's entered into by recognizing that you're a sinner who's in need of a Savior and that you trust in the finished work of Christ. Romans chapter 3, in fact, I'm going to read this for you because it really connects it to everything that we're talking about. Romans 3:21, it says, "But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe, for there is no distinction, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by His grace as a gift, through the redemption that is in Jesus Christ, whom God put forward as the mercy seat by His blood to be received by faith." The literal word there, which often people read it as propitiation, it's mercy seat. Christ is our mercy seat. He's the place where we find salvation, that God has given it to us, and God worked it on our behalf for us in our place, that Jesus Christ took our place, goes to the cross, pays the penalty that we deserved to make a way where there was no way. And the response, the proper response, what that ultimately calls us to when we really understand that is Romans chapter 12, verse 1. Paul says, "Now therefore, when you think about all the salvation that God has worked on your behalf, and all of that means for you, I urge you then to offer your lives as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to Him. This is your spiritual act of what? Worship." It's a call to worship. It's a call to worship. Secondly, it serves as a call to faith. A call to faith. Here is Israel. And they are coming into the promised land. And here's what we know is that there's these nations that are living in the land, and they've been there for a while. And having been there for a while, they've been able to fortify their cities and their lands. They've got armies. Here you've got the Israelites. And by the way, they've been slaves. This isn't like your well-trained army. These are slaves coming into the land against nations who've been there long term, and they're living in fortified cities. And the danger, once again, is the same danger they faced when they came to the border of the promised land the first time, which is what? It's fear. We're going into the land, and look, the first city they're facing is Jericho, which has pretty strong defenses. And we'll talk about, the walls that they've got around their city. And you can imagine, if I'm there and I'm looking at that city, from where we've come to, from where we are now, hey, we just crossed the Jordan River, isn't that wonderful? But look at that city. How in the world are we ever going to defeat them? And God is giving them a message that's very clear right here and right now as they cross the Jordan River that they're to remember. That they are going to face things that are bigger than them, but they're never going to face anything that's bigger than Him. And that as they follow after Him, here's what He shows Himself to be: faithful. They cross that Jordan River. He does what He promises. He parts the waters. He brings them through to the other side. They set up the memorial. And here's what the message of the memorial is. If God has been faithful to you, if God did what He said then, why in the world will He not do what He says moving forward? If He's been faithful in the past, is He going to stop being faithful today? If He's taken care of you up to this point in time, why is He going to do all that He's done? If He's going to rescue you out of Egypt, if He's going to provide for you and put up with you, by the way, as you go through the wilderness, because you're a bunch of complainers, not you, Israel I'm talking about. You all are complaining, you don't like the manna, you want more, you need this, you need that, you're not happy, you're not satisfied, let's go back to Egypt where there's fish, all of that. God puts up with you. He leads you through. He takes care of you. He brings you through the Jordan. Why in the world is He going to bring you through all of that and then leave you there to die? Can you not, if you could trust Him with all that, can you not trust Him moving forward? And by the way, let's stop for a moment and think about that in our own lives. 2 quick stories. I had a mom come into my office years back, and she had a situation with her son where he had basically, he'd gone, he was old enough to leave and to go out, but he had left and he disappeared. She didn't have any idea where he was. And she's just overwhelmed with fear and worry. What's going to happen to him? How do I know? What is it that's going? Why is it that this is happening? I don't understand. And I said, let me just ask you a question. Has anything like this in your life ever happened before? And do you know what she said? Basically, the same thing had happened once before. And I said, tell me what happened then. Tell me what the outcome was. And she said, well, everything worked out fine. In the end, and I said, were you afraid then? She said, yes, I was afraid then. I said, were you worried? Were you stressed? Were you anxious? She said, yes, I was. And I said, you prayed about it then? And God brought you through and everything worked out? Was He faithful? Did He show Himself to be faithful? Yes, He did. I said, so let me ask you this question. Can you trust Him to be faithful today? When you're living in fear and anxiety, ask yourself this question. Has God ever proven Himself to be untrustworthy or unfaithful? Has He ever? Has He ever not shown up? Has he ever said, you know what, forget you, you're on your own, I'm gone? Have you ever experienced that? I had a young man come into my office. He's in his early 20s who was in a situation where he was losing it. And I said, tell me what's going on. He said, I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job. I said, okay, that's a real honest fear. I get that, but let me ask you this question. Let's say that you do, because I'm not guaranteeing you won't. Do you think that God will be faithful and take care of you as you go through that, or do you think God's going to be unfaithful? Has God been faithful in the past? Yes. Do you think God's going to be faithful in the future? You put it into that context and suddenly things change, because you have to step back and ask a simple question is, am I really going to trust God or am I not going to trust God? Because that's really the issue that it comes down to. It's a call to faith. Are you going to trust me? Because you've been able to trust me. Look at everything that I've done up to now. Can you please remember all that I've done? And trust me so that we can move forward together. Romans chapter 8, Paul says this. He says, he who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, will he not also give us all things? Paul's saying, hey, listen, let's just look back for a moment. Let me ask you, did God spare his own son? Did God say, you know what? You're not worth it. Sure, I love you, but this is my son, and I'm not going to give him up. I'm not sending him to the cross for your sake. I'm not doing that. Did he do that, or did he give him up? Stop and think about, seriously, think about this for a moment. God loved you enough that he didn't even spare his own son. God loved you enough that he sends his son into this world, take on flesh and blood, so that he might live the life that you didn't, a life of perfect sinless obedience, so that he might then go to the cross and be treated as if he lived not only your disobedience, but my disobedience and the disobedience of every other person in this room and in this world throughout history, that Christ goes to the cross and gets treated as if he lived our collective life of disobedience. He suffers the full penalty of sin in our place, the judgment and the wrath of God for our sins in our place, so that we might be rescued and saved. If God would do all of that, why in the world would he then abandon you and say, forget it, I'm leaving you to just suffer and die? Is he going to do that? Paul says, if he wouldn't spare his own son, will he not take care of your needs? If he would take care of this massive need of your redemption, will he not take care of the small needs? If he would care for you this much, will he not care for you this much? He cares for it all. It's why Paul can say in Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Because no matter what I face, here's what I know. God is going to prove faithful. He doesn't abandon me. He doesn't forsake me. He's here with me, and he's going to provide for me as I need it. He'll give me what I need when I need it. He's faithful. And therefore I can trust him. And by the way, let me just really quick say this. This is why fear lives in the future. The reason fear lives in the future is because God doesn't give you what you need before you need it. He only gives you what you need when you need it. Have you ever been in a situation where you've thought, man, you see somebody going through something, you say, I could never go through that. I can't imagine going through that. I would never make it. And then you go through it and you make it through and you come out on the other side. What happens? How is that possible? The reason you said I could never make it through that at that moment is because God had not yet given you what you needed in order to go through that. So you're absolutely right. You couldn't go through it at that moment because you weren't going through it at that moment. Therefore, God didn't give you what you need to go through it at that moment. But when you faced it, when it came, when it happened in that moment, here's what God promises. I'm going to give you, as you follow me, I'll give you what you need. So in that moment when you face it, God provides not ahead of time, not before you need it, but as you need it. That's why fear lives in the future, because before you need it, before you've gotten there, look, that man that I talked about who was afraid that he was going to lose his job, do you know he lost his job? Do you know what didn't happen? His world did not fall apart. It didn't implode. He didn't die. I mean, he literally was going, I'm not going to survive this. If I lose my job, my life is over. Guess what? His life didn't end. He actually came out on the other side, and this isn't all the way that it happens, but he actually ended up getting hired back to a better job with more pay. He was afraid because he didn't have what he needed yet to go through that, but when it happened, guess what he had? He had what he needed. And that's God's promise. And the call of our memorials is, hey, listen, you can trust him. Don't worry about tomorrow, because when tomorrow comes, God will provide what you need. Here's the moment that you need to live in, right today, right here, right now, and you can have enough faith to entrust tomorrow to him. Because he's been faithful. And here's the last thing it calls us to. It calls us to obedience. It calls us to obedience. Right? God says, here's the deal. I'm going to work a miracle on your behalf. I'm going to part these waters. But you understand that this is not a blank check. God says to Joshua chapter 1, he says, I'll never leave you or never forsake you. That's not a blank check of God saying, hey, listen, go wherever you want, whenever you want, do whatever you want, and I'm going to be with you. Just don't worry about it. That is not what God is saying. God doesn't say, hey, listen, I'm going to part the waters. Whenever you get there, just let me know. I'll do it for you. And listen, you can come in groups. You can come all at once, or you can come on your own, or you can, the priest can go before you, or you can go first. Doesn't really matter. Here's the deal. I'm going to be with you, and I'm going to part the waters. You just get there. That's all I need. No, he doesn't say that. He's very specific. He says, here's the deal. I'm going to part the waters, but this is the way it's going to happen. It's going to happen in this number of days. The ark is going to go before you, and you're not going to come following right next to it. You're going to lag behind. In fact, somewhere between a half a mile to 3/4 of a mile, you're going to stay behind the Ark of the Covenant. Why? Because I'm about to lead you in places where you've never been before. And the key is, you need to follow me. God says, I'm going to work these miracles, but it's not a blank check. You have to walk in following me in obedience. God says, I'm going to be with you. I'm never going to leave you or forsake you. Do you know how we know that God won't, where we can be? Where God never leaves us or forsakes us. Do you know the context of that? It's in following Him in obedience. That's the context. God isn't saying, I'll be with you wherever you go. You go wherever you want. I'll follow you. No, God says, you follow me. And here's what you can know. We're going to go to places that are going to be places you've never been before, and it's going to be frightening. But here's the good news. Wherever I'm going and you're following me, here's the good news. There I'm with you. The context of the miracle is faith put to practice in following Him in obedience. And they obey, they do everything that God says, down to the very details of it, down to the placement of the stones and where they go. They follow and they're obedient, and God works the miracle, and they set up this memorial. And what's the memorial reminding them of in those moments where they're tempted to say, forget following God, let's go our own way? It's a memorial that's going, are you out of your mind? Seriously, you're thinking about not following? Do you remember when you followed Him what He did? Do you remember as you were obedient how He showed Himself to be faithful, and now you're thinking that it's a good idea to not follow Him? Seriously? It's a memorial that says this is a call to worship, it's a call to faith, and it's a call to following. It's a call to obedience. You know, one of my favorite poems is by Robert Frost. It's The Road Not Taken. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. And be one traveler long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps a better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for the passing there, had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay, and leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh. Somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that's made all the difference. Jesus says it in Matthew chapter 7. He says, enter by the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and the road that leads to destruction, and many are they who enter there. But narrow is the gate, and hard is the way that leads to life, and few are those who find it. Jesus makes a very clear invitation at the beginning of His ministry. He says, here's the key. If you want life, you've got to follow me. That's the narrow gate. And here's what we're told. It's not easy. It's hard, actually. Jesus says, hard is the way. Narrow is the great gate, and hard is the way. It leads you to places that are uncertain. It leads you to places where you're challenged and you're stretched, and it's hard and it's uncomfortable. And sometimes it's not very safe. But here's the thing, it leads to life. And the memorials that have been put in place say, hey, listen, we should worship, we should trust, but not only should we trust, but we should walk in obedience, because you and I know, you've tasted it, you've seen it, you've experienced it. As you walk in obedience, you've experienced that intimacy with God, and you've experienced His fulfilling of His promises and His walking with you in His presence, and you know what it's like, and you also know the other side. You know what it's like when you choose to go on the wide road that everybody else is on, when you choose not obedience and not following. You know what it's like in the emptiness and the darkness and the hardness and the pain and the sorrow and the guilt and the despair. You know all of those things. And the memorials that God has put in place says, hey, look and see. Do you see where we've been? Do you see what He's done? Do you see where He's led you? Do you remember the life that He's given? And now you're thinking about walking in a different way? Now you're thinking that disobedience is a good choice? Now you're thinking that way is the way that's going to lead to life? No. Remember. remember. God says, I want you to set up a memorial because I want you to remember. A call to life. A call to living, worship, faith, obedience. It's the same things for us. And here's what we need to do. Here's where I think this leaves us. Number one, I think we need to all be thinking about asking that question, what are the memorials that God's put in our life, and are we letting them do the work that God intends them to do? What are the memorials, right? We talk the cross, the empty tomb, communion, baptism. How about this one? And you may not think of yourself this way, but you yourself are a memorial that God's put in place. Your life is a memorial. Matthew chapter 5, you are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they place it on a stand that it might give light to the whole house. In the same way, let your light shine before men that they may see your good deeds and what? And praise your Father who is in heaven. Your life is meant to be a memorial. It's meant to be a call to worship. It's meant to be a call to faith. To say, look at what God has done. Look at what He's brought you through. Just stop. Step back for a moment and ask yourself, what has He brought you through? Do you see where He's been faithful? Those moments when you doubted Him. Those moments when you said, is He going to show up? And He did, and He was faithful, and He took care of you every step of the way. That He's never not shown up. Your life is meant to be a call to faith and a call to obedience. They say, I've walked with Him, I've been there, and I've walked the other road, and I know where both of those roads lead. Our lives are meant to be that together. Because it's not just me by myself that I'm the light of the world. It's us together. It's plural. You, us, we are the light of the world. That we might see each other's lives, to be close enough to see the memorial of your life, to see the memorial of my life, that it might serve as a call to worship. It might serve as a call to faith and obedience. What are the memorials that God's put in your personal life? Those things that He's saying, hey, don't forget this. You need to remember. And then we need to let them do their work, to call us to faith. And that's for some of us, it's the very beginning. It's the start. It's putting our faith and trust in Christ as Lord and Savior. To saying, you know what, I do believe. To surrendering my life to His control. To following Him. To say, I'm no longer a spectator, I'm a follower. To allow it to serve to call us to that obedience. To say, you know what, I am tempted to go in that direction, but I know that that's not the way that leads to life. I know that's not following Christ. And I know that if I go that way, I'm walking away from Him, and I'm not going to do that. To let it serve as a call to worship. And actually, we're going to do that together right now. And when we talk about worship, we're talking about more than just singing songs. We're talking about our lives. But we do sing and worship. That is a part of worship, which we're going to do as we close our service out together today. But understand that when we talk about it being a call to worship, not only is it meant to call you to worship, but it's meant to serve to help you to call other people to worship. Because He says, here's what I want you to do. When people look at your life and say, what does this mean? It's an opportunity to say, hey, take a look. I mean, our lives, people are meant to look at our lives and say, what does this mean? Not because because it's changed and transformed. To say, this doesn't make sense. How is it that your life is so changed? How is it that you're so transformed? Don't tell my boys this. They would be very embarrassed if they found out that I told you this. But yesterday, they wanted to watch Frozen. And we did. We watched it. But there's this one part that really, where one of the characters says, people don't change. Apart from grace, we don't. But when we look at our lives, we see they've been transformed and changed. It's how is that possible? How is it that this happened? And that's our opportunity to say, here's why. And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to open up with a song. And after that song, you see these two mics up here at the front. I'm going to give you a chance to share what God's been doing in your life with each other. This is our chance to say, look at what God has done. Look at what God has done. And here's the deal. And the only way we're going to do this, the only way it's going to happen is if you don't talk too long. So we're talking like 1 to 2 minutes. So think about that. But we're going to sing this first song, and what I'm going to ask you to do, because I'm not going to give you a lot of time to come up. If the mic is empty, we're going to move on. So as we sing, I'm going to ask you to just form a line at the mics. When that song is done, it's your chance. That's when you get to share. And then we're going to sing again, and if we still have time, I'll give you another chance. If God provides the opportunity, we'll share more with each other. But this is our chance for our lives to serve as that memorial that God has intended them to be, to call to worship. So what has God been doing in your life that you can share with each other, that you can share with us?